Hello. This is the Bible History School. This is the 8th session of Revelation and World History. Last time, we learned about the true nature of the seven-headed beast and 10 horns that appear in the Revelation. It was the history of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was established in December 1922 under Stalin's leadership. On December 25, 1991, it disappeared into the back alleys of history. When Soviet President Gorbachev declared the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it lasted exactly 70 years. During that 70-year period, the number of supreme powerholders who ruled the Soviet Union was 7 people: Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev. The Soviet Union consisted of 15 republics. Among them, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The 3 Baltic states had already become independent and joined the UN before the declaration of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was dissolved, 12 republics remained. Among them, Georgia did not join the Commonwealth of Independent States due to the Civil War. On December 8, 1991, when the Commonwealth of Independent States was founded, the 3 member states were Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Then, on December 21, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan joined, forming the Commonwealth of Independent States, excluding Georgia. Finally, on December 25, 1991, Gorbachev, then president of the Soviet Union, declared the official dissolution of the Soviet Union. Among the countries that gained independence from the Soviet Union, 10 countries, excluding Russia, were newly independent countries. When the republics including these 10 countries gathered together and gave strength to the Soviet Union had the appearance of a superpower. This is consistent with the situation in Revelation, chapter 17, section 13. They had one mind and gave their power and authority to the beast. And when these republics declared independence, the monster called the Soviet Union, that suddenly appeared in human history, in the 20th century suddenly disappeared. This situation is exactly consistent with the Bible's verse that these 10 horns destroyed the beast nation of Babylon. We have found a history that is exactly consistent with the contents of the prophecy that mentions the 7-headed beast and the 10 horns. This is an amazing fact in itself, but we do not stop here. In the text of the Bible, the name of the beast nation, named Babylon, is expressed in various ways. It describes the nature of the empire. We will substitute each of these names into the Soviet Union and verify whether the Soviet Union is indeed the beast mentioned in the prophecy. In this time, among them, we will look at the name, the one who died and came back to life. Chapter 1, Section 11. The one who died and resurrected. Let's look at the words of Revelation chapter 13, again. One of his heads seemed to have been wounded to death. But his fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth was amazed and followed the beast. Revelation chapter 13, verse 3. Died and resurrected means that he miraculously survived from a state where he was almost dead, due to a fatal wound. It is different from the expression, completely medically dead and then came back to life. In terms of a politician, it can be seen as his life as a politician almost ending, but after many twists and turns, he miraculously recovered. In the case of former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung, he was kidnapped and almost died. But he barely managed to return alive thanks to the rescue efforts of many people, 1973. And in fact, in the early 1980s, he was arrested by the new military regime on charges of conspiracy to commit sedition for orchestrating the May 18 Gwangju democratization movement behind the scenes, and was indicted on charges of conspiracy to commit sedition. He was sentenced to death by the Army Martial Law Department's Ordinary Court-Martial on September 17. And the Supreme Court confirmed the death sentence on January 23, 1981. If the execution had been carried out immediately at that time, he would not have become president. Kim Jae-gyu was sentenced to death for the assassination of President Park Chung-hee and executed immediately. If Kim Dae-jong had been executed as well, he would not have become president of the Republic of Korea. However, he was released without being executed, even though he had been sentenced to death. When we see that, he was able to rise to the position of president of a country where he had been sentenced to death. The expression died and came back to life becomes more realistic. One of the 7 heads was wounded and died, but after it healed, it became the head, that is, one of the most powerful people. This is the case of Lenin, who successfully led the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and initiated the beginning of the Soviet Socialist state. Let's take a quick look at Lenin's biography. Lenin was born on April 22, 1870 10th in the Russian Old Calendar, in Simbirsk on the Volga River as the 4th child of the Ulyanov couple. The Volga region was home to many Tatars, Mortvinans, and Chuvash peoples. It was also the place where several uprisings took place in Russian history. Among them, in particular, Stepan Razin, who led the Cossack uprising near the Volga River and the Caspian Sea in 1667, and was defeated at Simbirsk in 1670. And Pugachev, the leader of the Cossack people who opposed Russian absolutism during the reign of Peter III. In the 17th and 18th centuries. Hermann Weber, Lenin. Lenin's older brother Alexander was executed in 1887 for his involvement in the assassination of the Tsar. Lenin was subject to the system of collective punishment and was restricted from going to university. But thanks to his mother's efforts, he graduated from the law school at Kazan University and was able to work as a lawyer in St. Petersburg in 1893 at the age of 23. However, Lenin was not interested in law and devoted his energy to the study of Marxism and the labor movement. The life and ideals of the Red Heroes. Lenin suffered from severe pneumonia in early 1895. After recovering his health, he left Russia for the first time and traveled to Germany, Switzerland, and France. During that time, he connected with members of the Marxist circle who were living in exile, and also got to know Plekhanov, a leading theoretician of Russian Marxism. This trip was very stimulating for Lenin. In July 1895, Lenin went to a resort in Switzerland to treat his stomach ailment, and went to Berlin in late July. Lenin returned to Russia on September 19, carrying Marxist books with him. On October 11, he returned to Petersburg, and together with his future enemy Yuli Martov, formed a Marxist group within the Petersburg League of Struggle for the Liberation of the Working Class. While this struggle was in full swing, on the night of December 2021, 1895, Lenin was arrested along with his comrades. Lenin was held in solitary confinement in the investigative department's detention center for 18 months. He was in poor health. On February 10, 1897, the authorities deported Lenin to eastern Siberia and ordered him to remain under police surveillance for 3 years. The police department's report for December 1896 reads, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, assistant lawyer, responsible for the events in the Petersburg Social Democratic Circle, in custody since December 9, 1895. The Minister of Justice proposed a 3-year banishment to eastern Siberia. The police department agreed to this view. The record with the registration number 2778 was returned to the Ministry of Justice on December 18. Hermann Weber, Lenin. In February 1900, Lenin finally returned to St. Petersburg after completing his exile. He was 30 years old at the time. Lenin decided to leave for abroad immediately. On July 29, 1900, he went to Munich, Germany, and obtained an office to publish a new newspaper, Iskra. The word Iskra means spark in Russian, and the title can be seen as a reflection of Lenin's belief that the newspaper should be the spark that would bring down the Tsarist regime in Russia. Shortly after the publication of What Is to Be Done in March 1902, Iskra moved its offices to London, England. The core of Lenin's argument in What Is to Be Done was that only a controlled revolutionary movement, comprised of professional revolutionary workers, and led by a solid, consistent organization of leaders could liberate workers from the oppression of the bourgeoisie and arm them with socialism. In October 1902, while living in London, Lenin met Leon Trotsky, a revolutionary in his 20s who had read Iskra and came to visit him. Joseph Stalin also read the newspaper and became Lenin's supporter. John Honey, A World History Through People, Lenin. In this way, Iskra played a very important role in Lenin's journey. From his exile in Europe to the success of the October Revolution in 1917 and his rise to power. The above is a brief excerpt from Lenin's life. After this journey, Lenin returned to Russia in a sealed train in 1917 and led the October Revolution. On November 7, October 25 in the Russian Old Calendar, he wrote the proclamations of the victory of the October Revolution to the citizens of Russia and to the workers, soldiers, and peasants. And on November 8–9, at the Second Congress of the Soviets, Lenin was elected chairman of the People's Committee and head of government. Hermann Weber, Lenin's older brother, was executed for treason. Likewise, if the authorities had considered Lenin a threat to the system, when he was arrested and imprisoned and executed him, he would not have become the top leader of the Soviet Union. Even when he was exiled to Siberia, no one thought he would be a person who opened a new era in the future. But had been charged with treason and executed, he would not have ascended to the top position of the Soviet regime. However, when he, who had spent his years in exile, came to the forefront of history, countless Russians raised their hands and followed him, allowing him to become the first leader of the Soviet Socialist Republic. The meaning of the one who was wounded to death and whose wound was healed, recorded in Revelation chapter 13, verse 3, can be explained as follows. Although he had suffered from severe pneumonia, I think the meaning in the text should be seen as a political meaning, rather than a person who was sick and then came back to life. The fact that he was arrested, detained, and exiled, and his political life was almost cut off, but he recovered from his status as a person who was captured, seems closer to the meaning in the text. In other words, it should be seen as a situation in which he was able to return from exile and ascend to the position of the highest power in the country. Another figure who cannot be left out when discussing the Soviet Union, along with Lenin, is Stalin. Stalin was captured 7 times between 1902 and 1913, and exiled to Siberia, escaping 6 times. His exile in Siberia, which began in 1913, continued until 1917. Brenda Haugen, Stalin, the failed revolutionary in the swamp of power. If Lenin or Stalin had not been exiled but executed, they would not have ascended to power, and the situation of the Russian Revolution would have unfolded quite differently. In addition, Stalin was appointed to a key position that decided the party's policies at the party convention, held in Prague, Czechoslovakia in 1912, upon Lenin's recommendation. However, Lenin was concerned about Stalin's rough personality just before he died. Tried to have Stalin step down from his position. Thomas Hubler, A World History Through People, Stalin. A letter left by Lenin on January 4, 1923. Stalin is too rough. This defect is tolerable when interacting with comrades or communists, but it is not an acceptable problem when performing the duties of the Secretary General. For this reason, I asked my comrades to consider how we can force Stalin to step down. To step down and give this position to someone else. Hermann Weber, Lenin. If Lenin had lived a little longer. Considering Lenin's powerful influence in the early days of the revolution, Stalin probably would not have remained in that position, and would not have ascended to the position of the highest power in the Soviet Union. However, Lenin, who fell, could not rise again, and Stalin, who survived, eventually opened the era of a one-man dictator. During his reign, he communized the remaining republics that made up the Soviet Union. And after World War II, Eastern Europe also became communist. The Korean Peninsula was broken in half by the person he put forward. In 1950, the Korean War broke out due to Kim Il-sung, whom he had put forward. This Stalin also has the appearance of someone who died and came back to life. There is another meaning. Died and came back to life. The Chinese character used as a pronoun for the name of the Soviet Union is so. So means to come back to life, to revive. The character was chosen because it has the same pronunciation and sound as the so of the Soviet Union. And coincidentally, its meaning is to revive, meaning to die and come back to life. When the Chinese character was first chosen, no one realized this meaning and intentionally wrote it. But they simply chose the character with the same pronunciation. But surprisingly, the meaning matches. It is also the same as the phonetic value of the Korean alphabet. This means that when God planned this, He made the name of the country of Babylon. This means that God has made the sound and meaning of words coincide. It is truly amazing and mysterious. Last time, we revealed that the most important entity in the book of Revelation, the seven-headed, ten-horned beast, is the Soviet Union. We found a history that exactly matches the description of the existence of the beast nation, Babylon, described in the book of Revelation and the text of the prophecy. 7 rulers led the Soviet Union for 70 years. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, 10 new countries became independent. It is the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. We found a historical empire that had 7 heads and 10 horns. There are several nicknames for this Babylon in the text of the prophecy. This time, we learned about the one who died and came back to life. The Soviet Union is the empire that was ruled by 7 supreme rulers for 70 years and then fell. However, the Chinese character that refers to the Soviet Union is so, which means to revive, meaning to die and come back to life. Also, the 2 main figures who created the Soviet Union, Lenin and Stalin, also had a life journey similar to the meaning of this name. They were politically sentenced to death, but they were dramatically revived and created the beast called the Soviet Union. I realized that the beast in the prophecy refers to the empire that devours weak countries. The book of Revelation and world history are both composed of 12 chapters. Among them, chapter 1, the identity of the seven-headed beast, consists of 15 subheadings. Next time, we will look at section 12, Babylon the Great. In section 13, the name of the secret, the identity of the seven-headed, ten-horned beast, will become clearer. Please, continue to show interest and subscribe. This was the Bible History School. Thank you very much for reading to the end.